Alrighty guys, welcome back. We're going to look at lesson 7 today of Buddhism. Before we start, here's some revision that I want you to do, so write that down in your books and give it an answer based off last lesson's content. Again here, I want you to practice your key terminology and language of Buddhism. Remember, just test yourself on them, read it from here first, and then say it out aloud to yourself, see if you get it correct and check it within your book. On to today's lesson. This is our syllabus stop point today. So what we're going to look at is the nature and impact of change and resistance to change. So we've got two things there. We've got the nature and impact of change itself as our first focus, and then we're going to look at resistance to change in a lot of detail. Okay, so we'll start with the nature and impact of change in Buddhism itself now. So change, the idea and nature of change in Buddhism is sort of at the core of its philosophy. Okay, the idea that things aren't going to stay the same is central to their beliefs, because they're very, like Buddha preached that change is inevitable and that everyone has to keep up with change or you're not going to become relevant, essentially. So that's part of the reason why the Buddhist faith in general is so adaptable to other cultures and countries, is because at the core of its philosophy, it's very open to change and very willing to adapt to different countries, cultures around the world so that Buddhism can fit in. And I think the core beliefs of Buddhism itself allow that to happen quite smoothly. So Buddhists try not to fear change, because if you fear something, that means you're attached to it. So if you're fearing the change of something, by extension you can see how you're attached to it, because like one example I know one of the nuns gave, this is sort of why I know this is going to sound a bit weird, but this is why a lot of them shave their heads, because it removes that fear or temptation of how people may judge your appearance or something like that. So any concept of fear or change, because it's different, it's unknown, it's scary, they don't fear it. They see change as inevitable and constant, and to be in fear of it is silly, because you can't control change. Change just happens. And obviously if you're attached to something, that's going to lead to dukkha, which is pain, and tanha, which is attachment to worldly possessions. So when we're looking here at our next stop point, so that's sort of, the first thing there. So that idea that Buddhists are very happy with change. Well, not happy. They're realistic about it. They understand it's going to happen, and they don't fear it. Buddhism also embodies tolerance and respect for the ideas of others. It is a religion. It is a belief system that's very open and flexible to the needs and opinions of others. So that in of itself highlights the nature of change in Buddhism. Like I said earlier, it's so adaptable to different cultures. It can become globalized very easily. Again, a lot of the core teachings of Buddhism embodies tolerance, like we said here, and respect for the ideas of others. It's very non-judgmental. So therefore it's very open and flexible to the needs and opinions of others in shaping it. So it welcomes change, if anything. The history of Buddhism indeed shows that it can continually adapt to the cultures it encounters from around the world. So we see it spread from India. So it was very based on the Indian caste system. We had that idea of asceticism that came from Indian culture. That idea that you don't become attached to worldly possessions, sort of thing. And you can see as it's become globalized around the world, that a lot of the changes that have happened in Buddhism has been from the influence of other cultures. So for example, the rising importance of women in Buddhism is being seen all around the world, and you can sort of see that especially in Australia, where you've got like the temple that we were going to go to, it's run purely by women. It's all nuns. There are no males on site who are part of the order of nuns there. So you can see that the impact of Western culture has had on Buddhism itself. A lot of Buddhism people are using technology and stuff today as well, so you can sort of see the idea of change. Lastly, the idea of nature of change is because there's no fundamentalism in Buddhism. So fundamentalism, that word means like literally to the letter. If anyone's a fundamental, there is no room for interpretation. If they believe something and they've read it, they interpret it literally. It's sort of to the letter. So if I say something like, I don't know, chickens are evil, a really weird example just came to my head. There's no room for interpretation for that. Nothing can change my mind about that. So because there's no fundamentalism in Buddhism, and I've written yet, because it may change, that's why I doubt it, but it may. That's why it's become so successful and adapted to modern and westernized society quite well. So that's sort of the nature of change there. I've also got two things here that sort of build on that. So this is the Dalai Lama, the current one himself, says, if science proves some belief of Buddhism wrong, which I don't really think it can, because there's nothing scientifically bound to it, if that makes sense. It's all about philosophy. Then Buddhism will have to change. So the idea that the sort of guy that's considered Buddha reincarnated is openly saying that if someone proves some aspect of Buddhism to be incorrect, then we'll have to change with it, because if it's incorrect, then it's not right. Or even if it's incorrect to their cultural beliefs, it will adapt and change to that. Again, another sort of spiritual leader in Buddhism, Rinpoche, he said that emptiness is the Buddhist philosophy that all things have no fixed identity or inherent existence and are in a state of change and flux. So that idea that if you attach yourself to anything, Buddhists believe that everything will change and that change is inevitable. So that's sort of part of their idea of non-attachment, so that you can allow the force of change to happen without causing you pain or suffering. And he also said, not only are all things constantly changing, but if any phenomenon is analysed in enough detail, it is found to exist only in terms of its relation to other things. Now that's a bit of a hard to interpret. Essentially what he's trying to say there is our idea of social constructs, I guess you could say. That if you're not willing to change, if you look deep enough, the idea that you're not willing to change is based off a false perception that it has to stay the same, because whatever you're believing in has changed from something else in the first place. I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, you can email me. This next one here is looking at the impact of change. So we've looked at the nature of it, and we've got to look at the impact. Remember, that's our first. So we looked at the nature of change. Now we're looking at the impact of change. So like most belief systems, Buddhism has had to confront ethical dilemmas and moral issues raised by a modern world society due to the rapid technological and social changes that we experience. We will look at that a bit more later, but that's just briefly an impact of change. So for example, the ethical dilemmas that a lot of people have, say around gun laws or abortion or euthanasia, things like that, Buddhism has had to sort of has its say in that. Again, the Theravada strand would be very not opposed to it, but they wouldn't, or against it, they would just be indifferent to it, because they're again focusing on their individual enlightenment. But the other aspects and adherents of Buddhism have to become concerned with that, because that's an impact of change that's happening in the modern Western social and cultural world. So they have to have an opinion on it and a belief on it. But we will look at that later on. So in most areas, Buddhist leaders have been able to give clear teachings on contemporary social issues. Again, this is what I talk about, such as abortion, birth control products, euthanasia, human rights, the environment, and war. There was nothing in Buddha's core teachings that mentioned things like birth control products or euthanasia, because it wasn't something that was, brought up at the time. But through his other teachings, like his quote here, everything changes, nothing remains without change. It still works, and Buddhist leaders are still able to talk about these things. The impact of change again, Buddhism doesn't reject westernization, globalization, or technology. Again, they see that as part of our way of life and living. Instead, what they'll do is they encourage mindfulness and skillfulness in what we accept or reject in relation to technology, westernization, and globalization. So, for example, with technology, they can see a lot of the benefits of that in terms of like modern medicine and things like that. So again, that's a great use of technology. Their mindfulness, and again, the technology of you being able to connect with people around the world via social media, they could see that as a way to help spread Buddhism, right? But it can also be a way to create more social anxiety, comparing yourself to others, that sort of thing. So that idea of them encouraging mindful use of technology is still how Buddha or Buddhism can relate its core meaning and beliefs to that country. Does that make sense? So it's adapting to it. It's not changing its core beliefs necessarily, but it's definitely changing how people of that culture can relate to it. And again, Buddhism's big thing is as long as whatever we're doing is trying to, avoid suffering, then you can't go wrong. Buddhism preaches that as long as we act from compassion for others and avoid causing suffering for them or ourselves, it's possible to manage the modern world and to change with it. So as long as the core value of helping others and doing things that will lessen pain, then there's nothing wrong with whatever change happens. Does that make sense? What I've got now is a resistant to change document. So this is the document I want you to look at here. I've written this. Now it is fairly long, but it goes into a lot of depth and detail about this side of the dot point, that resistance to change. This dot point is very likely to be a 15 marker, so you've got a lot of info here and notes to help you with that. So we'll just start reading together. So like any belief system, Buddhism has its internal tensions and resistance to change. So despite Buddha and Dharma teaching not to fear, not to change. So again, what I'm trying to say is that nuns and monks are still humans. They're not perfect enlightened beings all the time. So there's still resistance to change within the two strands. There are two significant areas where Theravada Buddhists in particular have resistance to change, and that's these two. And we'll talk about that first. So the first was the invasion and colonization of Tibet by the Chinese in 1950 and 51. And that's why the Dalai Lama ended up being exiled, by the way, because they didn't believe in Tibetan form of Buddhism. And the attempt by the Chinese regime to break down Tibetan society and culture. So Tibetan people, so Tibet's just above India, and increasingly other Buddhists as well, they continued to resist that change. First inside and then outside as exiles in other countries, such as the Dalai Lama, but they do so without violence. So the Dalai Lama again is preaching non-violence. So he may be critical of the Chinese government's occupation of Tibet and their beliefs in there, but he's not going to, storm in there with monks armed with AK-47s. That's not going to happen. So the criticism here for that resistance to change within Theravada is the role that the monks played or didn't play, is more to the point, and their apparent unwillingness or indifference to take action during the periods of war and suffering. So throughout this time, essentially, the Theravada monks did nothing to help anyone while China was taking over Tibet. So there was no sort of resistance to that change. I suppose you could say in one breath that the Theravada people were accepting of that change. They realised it was outside of their control, so they didn't put any energy or time into trying to repel that, because change, as Buddha said, happens and you just got to go with it, essentially. But the criticism there is then it goes against that idea of pain and suffering. How can you help to alleviate people's pain and suffering? An idea would be to help them. So you can sort of see them taking Buddha's word quite literally, and not interpreting it as I say a Mahayana Buddhist would. The second area of resistance to change has been by the male-dominated monastic culture towards the ordination of women, so allowing women into the faith of Buddhism itself. Whilst today there are more women being ordained around the world, there are strong arguments based on Theravada scriptures. Just put that in there. Again, which is the Vinaya, against the practice. Whereas in Western Buddhism, so the Theravada, what we see, I don't know if you remember, there was that law where a monk can always correct a nun, but a nun can't correct a monk. So those sort of scriptures that favour men over women is sort of what we're talking about there. In Western Buddhism, though, changes have been made, especially in the conduct of monastic life, that are unavoidable. So they'll have to change. So if they showed any resistance to change, they wouldn't be able to adapt. So Theravada has resisted this sort of change, but the Mahayana haven't. So for example, in Western Buddhism, there isn't much of a lay community to support the monks and nuns. So they have to do things that their Asian counterparts wouldn't, such as handling money and driving cars. So for example, in Asian countries, a lot of the lay people who are Buddhists will happily donate an arm and a leg to help them continue their work. Whereas in Western society, our culture is very different. So a lot of the monks and nuns, if they are to be here, have to adapt to that change and do things that they wouldn't usually. Like we said there, handling money and driving cars. There's also a tendency to interact with the lay community on a more regular, intimate basis if you are in a Western country doing Buddhism. Because again, it's not our predominant belief system in Western countries, so you've got to work a bit harder to make it work. So for example, they'll provide a lot of counselling services, as well as meditation instruction, like the Nantian temple. So that's the sort of the first two. There are two more sort of areas around resistance to change. There's also debate of change in Buddhism as to whether it should accommodate Western values and philosophies, along with a more liberal Western lifestyle, as they think it can contradict the aesthetic aspects and teachings of Buddhism. So those aesthetic aspects, again, are non-attachment to worldly possessions, living a more simple and humbler life, not gloating in rich and wealth. So there's a lot of resistance to change, and also dissent there, whether Buddhism should be as accommodating as it is to Western philosophies. It can also extend from Western practitioners disputing in the actuality of reincarnation, so that idea of science arguing that it's literally impossible for you to die and then become reincarnated with the same personality, thoughts and visions of another person. So that idea of the Dalai Lama being reborn. So there's resistance to change and dissent around there as well. There's also trying to marry a serious meditation practice with family and career. So the idea that in Western society we are so busy with work, with social aspects of life, that often there isn't much time left in the day to focus on meditating and that practice of improving yourself. So you think like these monks will spend 6, 7, 8+ hours a day just meditating. Whereas in Western society, we literally, if we're trying to survive in our culture, we don't have time to do that. So there's sort of resistance to change in that aspect. These are just examples of why some Buddhists believe we shouldn't accommodate to them. And also that idea that Westerners try to find loopholes in everything so they can cheat, I suppose. So that they can have a glass of red wine because Buddhists don't believe in alcohol with their non-vegetarian meal. So it's free range chicken, so there was no harm involved in the killing of the animal, sort of thing. So that idea that Western culture has an answer and a loophole for everything, doesn't really bode well in that idea of Buddhism and non-attachment and things like that. So that's why there are clear divisions among Western Buddhists and the Buddhism people that believe the Asian model should be preserved a bit more closely. It's almost saying it's changed too much. And this is our next point here. So some people would even say that Buddhism has always adapted to its host culture, and it must suit the times to change. It must change to suit the times and expediency. So expediency there, meaning there to be sort of more practical but immoral at the same time. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that how much of Buddhism and the doctrine and practice can you change or should be altered, and to what extent does it change so much that it becomes another belief system entirely? Is it really Buddhism if we can do all these things as well? Like if we're picking and choosing the bits we like and disregarding the rest that comes with it, does that mean it's actually still Buddhism? So there's some resistance to change around that aspect and idea. And lastly, there's some dissent surrounding the notion and some resistance to change around the notion that traditional Buddhism seems to appear indifferent from the world's problems. So that idea that they're resistant to change, despite having strong beliefs against violence and suffering, they still didn't take action to help. So for example, there are prisoners on the Burma Railway in World War II, and they were really disturbed by the lack of indifference shown by the Theravada monks to their plight. There was no offers of help, and those people who just had their lives ruined was still expected to continually donate and help out the monks in their life. The reason, again, that the Theravada monks didn't intervene is that they believed that all experiences would result from past karma. And that can only be remedied by the individual changing their behaviour. So in other words, whether they helped or not, it wouldn't have made a difference. So, whereas Mahayana, this should be a new paragraph. Mahayana has already established that idea of bodhisattva. So, in terms of resistance to change in Western culture, you can see why they would resist Theravada, but not so much Mahayana, because it's a bit more proactive. The karma-enhancing attitudes to current world issues sort of suits Western ideas and ideology as well. So what I want you to do now is answer these two questions in your book, and I will check those, and that would be it for this lesson. Thank you.